In week 6, we're looking at the topic of child sexual abuse. This is notes from chapter 5 in the Barnett textbook. In this presentation, I'm also adding in some slides from another text that I have taught a similar course from, and that is Cynthia Crossan-Tower's textbook, Understanding Child Abuse and Neglect. And I've been operating out of the 7th edition of that text. There may actually be a newer edition now. This is a very difficult topic for many individuals, and it has many emotional implications for professionals, students, and the general public, in fact. And there's probably no field or no part of the field in child protective services and in family violence that generates more feelings and stronger feelings than child sexual abuse. And so as we work through this material, some of the material may seem rather difficult, but I say again that as a professional that will be working in the field, it's important that we develop a sort of detachment from the particular issues that arise as we work through these topics, and because it's going to make us much more effective in helping our clients. Indeed, we need to be able to have some objectivity, never losing our sensitivity to what our clients are going through, both victims and perpetrators, I would add, but nonetheless to have enough detachment that we can present a balanced and helpful presentation to the clients when we work with them. The definitions of child sexual abuse, like other definitions in this field, is another area really to look at and to try to determine. And some of the biggest questions here when we look at defining this is determining culturally what is appropriate or inappropriate in terms of behavior, and just where the line is when what might be considered normal touching becomes abusive in nature. When does sexual interactions between two individuals become abusive? These are two of the ways that two of the lines, I guess, that we look at as we define child sexual abuse. From culture to culture, definitions of what's appropriate and permissible, even considered to be healthy for children, really varies very wildly. And I can remember attending a conference on sexual abuse, in fact, about 20 years ago down in California, and there were participants from all over the world in this workshop, and it was at a National Center for Excellence in Abuse of Child Abuse Victims and Perpetrators and their families, called the Giarretto Institute, and I believe it's still there. And I can remember one participant from, I believe, the Philippines, who was there and talked about, in the process of educating her nephew. She had a nephew who was living with her and who was very curious, and he caught her peeking at her a few times as she was changing clothes, or she caught him rather peeking at her as she was changing clothes, and described how she took this 11-year-old boy into the shower with her to show him rather all her body parts, and allowed him to touch her breasts and things like this. And so you can guess probably that many of the American students that were in that workshop were fairly disturbed by the image, and there's quite a discussion that followed about that, about whether this was acceptable and appropriate or not. But nonetheless, this really defines how what might be appropriate in one culture and acceptable in another culture is something that is considered to be wildly inappropriate in another. And then in further efforts to define sexual abuse, we're looking at whether or not body contact was established. Sexual abuse can occur even without any touching involved, voyeurism and exposing oneself to a child, those kinds of things. And also sometimes touching genitalia isn't necessarily sexual abuse. For instance, parents changing diapers on children, sometimes when kids have some sort of a rash or disease and need ointments applied and they can't do it themselves, those kinds of things. And so doctors touch their patients in their genitals frequently, so doing so doesn't necessarily mean it's sexually abusive. Other ways of determining this is the intention of the perpetrator. Does the perpetrator intend the act to be stimulating, or is it an accidental kind of contact? Does the perpetrator have a relationship where he or she can exercise power and control over the victim? What are the age differences between the perpetrator and the victim? From state to state, the correct or the proper differences in age depends, as well as what we call the age of consent. And the age of consent is that age in which a child is able to is considered to be mature enough to consent to sex themselves. In the state of Alaska, that age is 16, but in other states that varies and is younger in other states and perhaps older in still others. The difference in age between the perpetrator and the victim for someone below the age of consent might vary from 2 years difference in age up to, in some states, 5 years differences in age. Alaska had always been 3 years difference in age between the perpetrator and the victim for it to be considered child sexual abuse. And then a few years ago, the legislature changed that actually to 4 years differences in age in most cases. So personally, I think that's a step backwards, but I think there were a number of different reasons why that occurred. What type of abuse, what kinds of abuse occurred, do we have a broad definition of sexual abuse or a very narrow definition? And what is the historical and cultural context? We have talked about the cultural context already. Looking at the historical context, for instance, without saying that I have any sympathies at all for the individuals in the power structure of Penn State as far as the scandal that was in the news in, I think, 2011, 2012 regarding Jerry Sandusky molesting those children. In the 80s and the 90s when this was occurring, our understanding of sexual abuse and how best to approach it and treat it was very different than it is today. And a lot of the judgments that we make about the actions and behaviors of individuals back in the 80s and 90s do not include the context of where we were historically in terms of understanding abuse and what to do with it. And so that's an important thing. You can't really look at past behaviors and say today that was appropriate or inappropriate without considering what was going on at the time. So definitions for child sexual abuse can be very simple, they can be very complex, and your textbook has a number of different definitions from different agencies and organizations that address this problem. There are two simple definitions that I like. One in the text that says, it's by, I think, Lucy Berliner. It says that sexual abuse involves any sexual activity with a child below the age of consent. That does kind of leave out the possibility that another child below the age of consent might be engaged in that and might not be sexually abusive in that event. But anyway, this is a good, simple, to the point definition. Another out of the Cross and Tower text that I mentioned earlier is sexual abuse is the use of a child for the sexual gratification of an adult, which really does speak more to the difference in age. It's very important for us to know what is defined as normal touching in any culture in order to understand what is to be considered abusive. How frequently does child sexual abuse become disclosed? And this is something that we're pretty sure that we don't hear about most of the cases of child sexual abuse. And the prevalence rate is affected very much by the disclosure rate. Later on, we're going to talk a little bit about why child victims in particular might not want to disclose child sexual abuse, what keeps them from doing so. And so suffice it to say at this point that the prevalence rate is, in statistics, is probably lower than what the actual prevalence rate is. There are some questions about the accuracy of records compiled by Child Protective Services. The thinking is the rate is something like 4 to 6 times higher than CPS records indicate. And some of that has to do with the pressure on the workers to be able to come up with some evidence to support the allegations. And workers in investigations in CPS may really truly have a strong sense that abuse occurred, but may not have the kinds of indications that were the finding appealed by the alleged perpetrator, which often occurs these days. Or were we to go into court, could we demonstrate this in a way that would satisfy the court? And so there are times when workers really strongly suspect abuse occurred, believe abuse occurred, but may not be able to substantiate it. And so that's one of the reasons why our records will probably not demonstrate what we really believe is going on. Also, many victims don't disclose immediately for many years, and there are a number of factors. Again, I think I touch on this a little later in this talk, that some of the factors that affect disclosure include, how the nature of the relationship with the perpetrator is. I, over the years, have talked with child victims who have described the relationship, even of the perpetrator outside of the family, as being, gee, he was just like my dad, and I didn't want to get him in trouble. I felt sorry for him. He seems really lonely. All of those kinds of things, that sometimes victims And this is one of the things that the perpetrators do in grooming the victim, is establish that relationship, which sometimes is upended and is opposite to where the child victim finds himself looking out for and caring for the feelings and the needs of the perpetrator. How severe the abuse was. Sometimes victims may convince themselves or may be convinced by others that simple touching of the genitals, for instance, over the body may not warrant a report. Some cognitive factors: are kids able to understand whether or not something was abusive? And frankly, this is something that's not only cognitive, like someone who has a low IQ or doesn't have any education, but also among, for instance, high school students that may not know still what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of sexual contact between individuals, or how that contact occurs, because of a variety of factors. Females here are much more likely to disclose abuse than males. That doesn't mean that the majority of females do, but they're more likely to disclose. Males are a lot more reluctant to disclose because of a number of other implications that go along with sexual abuse. Usually the perpetrators are male, and male victims also oftentimes have fears of being labeled a homosexual or whatever because of that kind of behavior or that kind of incident. Sometimes young male victims, in fact, are very confused by what occurs and thinks that this is something that makes them a girl, and different kinds of things. So there are a number of reasons why male victims may not want to disclose. It is important as much as possible to have medical exams completed as quickly as possible after most disclosures. And with modern multidisciplinary techniques now being used in investigating child sexual abuse, many areas have a child advocacy center that coordinates medical examination, CPS investigation, law enforcement legal investigations, for prosecution, attorneys, and all of those individuals come together to staff cases and look at cases together. And so medical examinations with the proper kinds of equipment is another part. That's something that's very important in this, are more available now than they were 10 or 15 years ago, but still not available in all areas. Young children are very suggestible, and there is a debate about whether or not you can believe little kids. And as this slide says, it's very, very rare that children will lie about sexual abuse. A text that I worked out of years ago that is still one of the primary texts in terms of child maltreatment is from the Kemp Center in Colorado, and it's called Child Maltreatment, I believe. In fact, it was one of the seminal texts used in the area of child abuse. And in that text suggests that as children get older and really more into adolescent years, sometimes allegations made by adolescents can have a value that it gives them some other gain, some other secondary gain. And they don't suggest that you don't believe adolescent victims, but understand that sometimes adolescent victims may be motivated for other reasons and may choose to report something that didn't occur. By the same token, however, adolescent victims may also choose not to report, according to some training programs that I participated in, because it gives them a certain kind of control and power with the perpetrator. So reporting is something that just really is a very unpredictable kinds of things. Getting back to the suggestibility issue, Stephen Ceci, I believe, at Cornell University, was the individual who did a lot of research on the suggestibility of young children, and his research indicated that very young children sometimes can be led to believe certain things have happened, and this is where leading questions and coaching by adults may do this, and such that eventually those children begin to believe that what they've been told to say actually happened. This is that suggestibility part. And in fact, some of the studies indicated that some of those children actually went on to kind of add their own details to the story that was concocted by the adult coaching them. However, again, I want to stress that generally speaking, children tell the truth when it comes to sexual abuse, and so while this is an issue that's often brought up in court, if you're in a case like this, it's something you need to keep in mind. Nonetheless, there are other ways to kind of test out some of those statements to see if the statements are based in reality or not, which we really don't have the opportunity to get into in this venue. The trauma of sexual abuse itself can have a debilitating effect on children's memory, but there are those that think that the sexual abuse itself actually enhances some of the memories around those things because of the the focusing of the psyche on what's going on. There is also a debate about repressed memory, and we touch on this later on, because this is one of the reasons why sometimes victims choose not to report, is because there is this movement out there. It's probably less strong than it might have been 10 years ago against what they call repressed memory or recovered memories. There is a group of individuals out there who believe that therapists suggest and tease out statements from victims that and plant memories in their thinking that would lead to them having been sexually abused. What the therapist's motives would be for that is beyond me, but there are many people who believe that these repressed memories, that it is a false memory. But there was one study with 100 documented sexual abuse victims between the ages, people who had been molested between the ages of 10 months and 12 years of age, when they were questioned 17 years later, so they would have been adults at this point. 38% of them did not recall the substantiated incidents. In other words, there were experts in that were aware of the fact that the abuse occurred, that demonstrated it, proved it, substantiated it, and yet more than a third of them didn't remember those incidents 17 years later. Some of those would be very young children. That's not uncommon. Of course, we don't remember a lot of things from those very early years, but that goes to show how vulnerable very young children can be, and why it is sometimes that, and I'm not suggesting this is the case for all children who have unexplained acting out behaviors, but sometimes the kinds of behaviors and disturbances that we see with little children and we don't have explained might be able to be traced back to this. And with little children who aren't verbal yet, we don't really know exactly how it is that memories are formed around that time, and it's very possible that they can't access those memories in a way to talk about it because they didn't have words in their brains to store those memories with when it was occurring. Well, again, the fact that victims don't remember their abuse is not an unusual thing at all. And some of the critics, as I said, talk about the fact that there are some people out there who believe that almost everybody, if you ever have any kind of feeling of uncomfortableness around sexuality or somebody of the opposite sex, that's probably an indication that you were molested as a child. And people read that and sometimes believe that, and it maybe can influence our memory. But, that's, I think that's sort of what would you call it, a red herring, I think, in this whole discussion about recalling sexual abuse. So it is widely believed that our official records underestimate the actual incident rate of sexual crimes. Here you see the statistics from 2008 from Health and Human Services, the federal agency that identified over 750,000 maltreated children. And this is only records from Child Protective Services, whereas other studies have indicated as much as 1.25 million maltreated children, when you expand that to include professionals and other counselors involved. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study that we have talked about from time to time of the sample, and I forget the number of number of adults that were sampled, but of those, over 9,000 women and nearly 8,000 men reported having been sexually abused in their childhood. That's about 25% of women and 16% of men. And again, if you go back to the fact that men oftentimes, in particular, are reluctant to disclose because of those implications I mentioned earlier, is a pretty safe bet that more of these men had been molested than reported it. Likewise with women for other reasons that we'll be talking about in a few moments. The interesting thing is there's a reported decline in the rate of child sexual abuse that has been noted around the nation over the last decade or so, and there's been a real discussion about whether does this indicate that there's actually less child abuse, that our interventions are less sexual abuse, that our interventions are becoming more effective, that educating children to say no and those kinds of things, those refusal skills, is really having an effect, that we're empowering mothers to leave perpetrators, that perpetrators are getting more effective treatment. We want to believe that's the case in the field, but it remains to be seen. There are some studies that suggest that this trend is real. However, note that we're not talking about the rate of child sexual abuse lowering necessarily. We're talking about the reporting rates of child sexual abuse. This could also mean that it might be just that people are reporting things not as child sexual abuse but as neglect or other things, so that sexual abuse is really not really being identified in those reports as much as they once were for different reasons. So why is sexual abuse underreported? For one thing, it's very difficult to identify and to prove. Sexual abuse does occur in secret and privacy, and oftentimes the only person that knows about it, or that witnesses it at least, is the perpetrator and the child victim. And juries are reluctant to believe the statements of children on the stand in particular, when it comes as opposed to an adult. And oftentimes the perpetrators are, they're not necessarily creeps from the shadows of the bushes, and the guy that lives down the street that never comes out of his house and has these kind of weird smells emanating from his home or anything. A lot of times perpetrators are, and I'm talking about men, and they do involve women as well, but more usually men that are contributing members to society, sometimes in powerful positions. Businessmen, educators, counselors, all sorts of different walks of life. And so the statement of a victim, a child who's probably exhibiting disturbed behaviors anyway, versus the statement of those persons, oftentimes juries have trouble believing and feeling that they're convinced that it occurred. And so kids a lot of times are not believed when they tell, and if they do tell, a lot of times family members won't report that outside of the family because of the fact that, well, there are some family systems individuals would say would disrupt the family dynamics, but also because this is just something we want to keep within ourselves. It's not something that I think most individuals are eager to bring to the attention of the officials. When you get into actually talking about interviews and things, investigators a lot of times have difficulty discussing sex with children. First of all, because we're raised not to talk about sex with little kids, and kids are taught not to talk about sex with adults, and so that discussion, even in an investigation scenario, it feels unnatural. And individuals, professionals, whether it's law enforcement, social workers, CPS workers, counselors, whoever, need to be trained in how to talk about this topic with children. And there are some very specific programs out there that guide professionals through this discussion with kids, so that the information that is gained doesn't involve leading questions and allows the child to tell the story without being suggested by the adult. Even still, it can be a very difficult topic. And I had one training I was in on forensic interviewing where the participants in the workshop were asked to list all the different names we had for all the different body parts, all the genitalia, and every foul and obscene and whatever term it was for each body part. And we made that list, and we were to read them out loud. And a lot of people in the training session, and these are grown adults, professionals, had great difficulty with that experience. We have to be able to say those words because those are the words that our kids are going to use. And so those kinds of things sometimes can discourage children from reporting, because kids are going to know if you're uncomfortable talking about the topic with them. When we do report, when we get good interviews, services tend to be poorly coordinated to treat the victim. And oftentimes there is a taboo that really stigmatizes the victim as much as the perpetrator. And as I mentioned earlier, the false allegation movement has made reporting more difficult for some because of the fears that individuals won't believe them. Who are the victims in sexual abuse reports? Any child between the ages of 0 and 18 can be a victim, and it varies from infancy to 18. And I think there's some tables and statistics in the book that you can look at that would tell you the specifics, but it does appear that most of the cases, the largest percentage of cases at least, occur between the ages of 12 to 14. And these are reported cases now, so you have to consider the fact that kids that are in school are going to report more because, first of all, they have the verbal skills. They've probably received some education, and they've had the ability to compare their experience to their peers and see that it's wrong. Children who are preschoolers don't have those things, don't have the contact with people outside so much, and so they're less likely to report. So you have to keep these statistics in mind. The age issue may be irrelevant, and the idea that most cases are between ages 12 and 14 simply means most cases are between 12 and 14. It does not mean, or the largest percentage of cases are between 12 and 14. It does not mean that most victims are between 12 and 14. I hope you get the difference there. Females are more likely to be victim than males of child sexual abuse. There isn't any particular pattern in terms of race and socioeconomically, although sexual abuse occurs at all socioeconomic levels. Children in lower socioeconomic status families are more vulnerable, and we'll be touching on reasons for that in a later slide. This is the later slide. In fact, children that are at a higher risk for sexual abuse include those children who are socially isolated. And again, if you think about lower socioeconomic status kids, oftentimes those kids are what we call the latchkey kids. Both parents are out working. There's no one home when they come home from school. So maybe they don't go home from school, or maybe they hang out at the mall or whatever. They're also engaged in community organizations, and perpetrators sometimes prey on the kids in those organizations as well. These children probably have less contact with their parents because of the fact that parents are working, and so they're looking for somebody, an adult, to take an interest in them. And so these socially isolated kids, and again I'm talking about latchkey kids in particular, but any socially isolated kid can be more risk for sexual abuse. And I would also say the fact that isolation is something sometimes that the perpetrator creates. And so if it's a parent or a step-parent, it may be a family that lives very remotely, and the parent, those very rigid boundaries in the family system we were talking about some weeks ago, the parent doesn't let the children go to school. They homeschool the kids. They don't let them out to participate in sports. The children have no relationship with peers outside of the immediate family, those kinds of things. Sexual abuse is best maintained in an environment where there isn't somebody else coming into contact with the family. Poor supervision, less supervision, again, as I mentioned earlier, for obvious reason. Children who have had parents who have been abused, and particularly their mothers, tend to also be at a higher risk for sexual abuse. Families with marital problems are preoccupied. The adults are preoccupied more with each other, may be experiencing a lot of their own emotional difficulties, and so are less likely to be able to tend to the children and watch what's going on with them. And in situations with parents abusing alcohol, the statistics indicate that boys are more likely to be at a higher risk for sexual abuse, for whatever reason that is. And so you see there's a number of different things that, by the way, this is not in our textbook, this is out of the other text. There's a number of different things here that may contribute to the likelihood of sexual abuse. Once read an article written by a perpetrator who would find his victims routinely in places like the mall, where kids that really don't have anything to do and don't have a lot of supervision might just go to hang out, particularly those kids that are sort of like pubescent and early adolescent and those kinds of things. And the perpetrator wrote about how he would spend enough time in the mall just sitting there watching kids that hung out there that he could see the dynamics in the groups of the kids, and would look for the kid that was sort of on the outside of the group, that was kind of struggling to get in to the group but not quite accepted, and that would be the kid that he would prey on. And because again, not only did that kid not have adults in his life, but wasn't really being accepted by peers, and so would be very, very susceptible to the advances of an adult who looks like he's caring and concerned. We'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of child sexual abuse perpetrators before I close out this particular segment. Single parents are overrepresented, and single parents with cohabitating partners have higher rates of child sexual abuse. And so I believe these are the dynamics about the homes in which the child lives. Anyway, children in the homes with parents with cohabitating partners have a rate of sexual abuse 10 times higher than those that live with both biological parents. And so the nature of the relationship between the parents is a significant factor, and single parenting tends to increase risk. For some reason, I think this is on the wrong page, but anyway, here it is. The age of the perpetrator is often between 30 and 40 years of age, but as you see, 17% in one study were juvenile offenders, were under the ages of 18 years of age. And incidentally, in my experience of working with sex offenders, adult sex offenders, many of them, if not most of them, were perpetrating when they were adolescents. And some of those guys told us that if somebody had stopped them when they were teenagers, they think they wouldn't have been perpetrating when they were adults. might be just a way of blaming others around them for the fact that they did what they did as adults. But I think there's some validity to that. I believe the lesson to be learned is that sometimes, you think about, well, these are just kids and they're experimenting. There's different ways of telling whether there's experimenting going on or whether it's an abusive type of relationship. And again, something that probably we just don't have the chance to go into here. But we shouldn't just shove aside those kinds of things when we encounter them with kids, because some of these adolescent offenders really need help and can get help at that age and can really change their life in a lot of ways. Gender perpetrators are more likely to be males than females, and you can see, I've seen other statistics that say more like 98% of the sexual abuse perpetrators are males instead of 93%, but you can see by far most of the perpetrators are male. There is a lot of study going on about female perpetrators, and not a lot of treatment available, at least in terms of groups. There's much more treatment available for adult male offenders than female offenders. And again, I suspect the dynamics with female offenders may be very different than that with male offenders. Is the perpetrator from within the family or outside the family? The most typical perpetrator is an acquaintance of the family or the child, not necessarily a family member, but somebody who knows the child or the family at least. And so with that, I'm going to close this segment, and if you will go back into the course and click on part 2, we'll continue this discussion and look at dynamics, effects, intervention, policy, and prevention in child sexual abuse. Thank you.